What was the characteristic capability or locality from which the German, French, and British derived their freedom of action, physical strength, or will to fight? We look at the centre of gravity analysis for the Battle of France, 1940. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 68 of the Principles of War podcast. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the desired end states for each of the three main participants in the battle, and we're going to then try and derive their centre of gravity, and from there we're going to look at some of the critical vulnerabilities which they needed to protect and which their adversaries needed to attack. Before we get into it, we'll do a quick doctrine review, and for that we'll be using land operations from the British Army's Land Warfare Development Centre, and we might just quickly skip into the Joint Military Appreciation process for the Australian Joint Doctrine. Before we become decisively engaged with the friction and the fog of war that is centre of gravity analysis, it's important to remember a couple of points. One, this is really to get you to start thinking about it. So I may not have the correct answer here, I probably don't, but the key thing is to get you thinking about what you think the centre of gravity would be. And then the second part of that is to see what critical vulnerabilities fall out of it. The real art of centre of gravity analysis and the indicator that you have done it successfully is that you come up with critical vulnerabilities that are going to deny the enemy their ability to achieve the end state that they are trying to achieve. I don't think it really matters how we get there. It doesn't really matter what we identify as being the center of gravity, as long as the critical vulnerabilities are going to be targetable in our plan and that the successful destruction, disruption, or dislocation is achievable with the means that you have. So straight from the doctrine, the centre of gravity can be deduced from analysis of what actors need to achieve their aim. It describes the primary element of their power in relation to a particular situation. At the tactical level, a centre of gravity of military actors, friendly or enemy, is usually the principal physical element of their force. By dint of being the centre of gravity, its defeat leads to that of the force as a whole. While a centre of gravity is relatively enduring, it is not fixed. Understanding must be continuously refreshed to test whether the original assessment remains valid. Critical capabilities, which are commonly expressed as a verb, describe what a centre of gravity can do that makes it so powerful. For example, a particular armoured formation may form the tactical centre of gravity of a force, which could be our own, an enemy's, or a partner's whose capacity we are building. Its critical capabilities in this example may that it can manoeuvre and strike in depth. Critical requirements are the resources or means which are essential to the realisation of critical capabilities. Usually described as a noun, following the example above, they could include specific weather conditions, avenues of approach, or the armoured formation's morale, fires, combat service support, or combat engineer forces. Critical vulnerabilities are those requirements or components of them that are deficient or vulnerable to neutralisation or defeat in a way that will contribute to a centre of gravity failing to achieve its critical capability. Continuing the example in a combat context, we cannot affect the weather, and critical combat service support elements may be very well protected. The combat engineer forces, however, may be particularly vulnerable, and if they are dislocated, disrupted, or destroyed, the force will lose the critical manoeuvre support elements to achieve its objectives. In combat, an indirect approach seeks not to target the centre of gravity directly, rather to apply strength against critical vulnerabilities. The NATO definition of the centre of gravity is that characteristic capability or locality from which a nation, alliance or military force or other grouping derives its freedom of action, physical strength or the will to fight. The purpose of a centre of gravity analysis is to identify active vulnerabilities that can be attacked or threatened or to be protected or strengthened. Designed for strategic and operational level analysis, it is also a useful tool for land forces at the tactical level. So that's the current NATO definition. The one I will just slip in there is the current Australian doctrine, the Joint Australian Doctrine, which defines the centre of gravity as being the primary entity that possesses the inherent capability to achieve an objective or the desired end state. The three that we're going to look at, German, French, and British, are all different for really interesting reasons. The British centre of gravity changes because of a desired end state. That change occurs on the 10th of May when the Germans commence Fall Gelb. The German centre of gravity is really interesting because they're going to use an operational centre of gravity at a national strategic level. The French centre of gravity is pretty interesting as well because I believe that the selection of the centre of gravity for them actually sowed the seeds of defeat for the entire French nation. We're going to start by looking at the centre of gravity for the British, and as I said before, we're going to divide this into two parts. So first off, we're going to look at the British centre of gravity prior to the 10th of May 1940. Specifically, we'll be looking at the role of the Chamberlain government, which lasted until the 10th of May 1940. For this, I'm going to lean heavily on Robin Pryor's excellent book, When Britain Saved the West. The desired end state was to avoid war. Chamberlain detested war, and his government and previous governments had failed to stand up to Hitler and the Third Reich as they started breaking the conventions of the Treaty of Versailles through to the remilitarisation of the Rhineland, annexation of Austria, and the conquering of Czechoslovakia. This led to the invasion of Poland. If that is the desired end state, then what is the entity that is capable of achieving that? And so I would say that it is the instruments of national power that Britain had at the time. Specifically, it is the coordination of the instruments of national power to create a whole-of-government approach towards avoiding war with Germany. It's not a specific centre of gravity, however, at the strategic level, they tend to be more intangible. We will discuss a range of ways that the Chamberlain government attempted to bring about this end state, avoiding war with Germany. What are instruments of national power? There's a couple of ways that we can define those. So the one that has been around for quite a while is DIME, diplomatic, informational, military and economic. That's what we're going to use because I think it fits quite neatly with what it is that we want to talk about today. That has been evolved somewhat, and now the new acronym that many people talk about is MIDFIELD. And that describes military, informational, diplomatic, financial, intelligence, economic, law, and development. MIDFIELD is probably more appropriate for contemporary analysis of instruments of national power, but for what we want to talk about today, DIME is going to do just fine. Today we're going to use definitions from a US Joint Doctrine Note 1/18 strategy because it gives a nice succinct illustration of what each of these components are. So the diplomatic instrument, the essence of this is engagement, how a nation interacts with state or non-state actors, generally to secure some form of agreement that allows the conflicting parties to coexist peacefully. Two important considerations for any strategist contemplating economic action in pursuit of strategic ends are globalisation and the particular natures of individual state economies. The information instrument is about creating, exploiting and disrupting knowledge. A state or non-state actor generally benefits when it enjoys an information advantage over another party. Creating and exploiting that information advantage is the key to the employment of the information instrument in national security strategy. The infrastructure, capabilities and processes by which a state or non-state gathers, analyses, disseminates and exploits information are crucial, foundational and institutional dimensions of power. Communication, synchronization, and information activities are two primary effects created to achieve the state's strategic informational objectives. The essence of the military instrument is the use of force by one party in an attempt to impose its will on another. This use will entail applying force, threatening the application of force, or enabling other parties to apply force in furtherance of strategic ends. Force can be applied across a broad spectrum and in multiple forms. It can occur in any domain, land, maritime, air, space, and the informational environment to include cyberspace. Threat of force is used to compel an adversary to modify current behaviour or to shape future action. It works by deploying and posturing military capabilities and issuing warning statements that convey a decision to use force if one's conditions are not met. Force enabling entails increasing the capability of international partners to apply force and usually occurs in close coordination with the diplomatic and economic instruments. It can include providing weapons and material, training and education, joint combined exercises, foreign internal defence and advisory missions. Security cooperation sets the conditions that prevent conflict, shape the security environment, compete for influence below the threshold of armed conflict, and prepare US forces to respond to contingencies. Security cooperation includes military engagements with foreign defence and security establishments, DoD-administered security assistance programs, combined exercises, international armaments cooperation, and information sharing and collaboration. Security cooperation programs and activities are normally integrated and synchronized with the other instruments of national power. The economic instrument focuses on furthering or constraining others' prosperity. Economic power is frequently considered the heart of national power. Whether the state has the economic power to pursue a particular strategy or whether the effort to attain a strategic end will consume too much of the state's economic power are crucial national strategy judgments. Few, if any, strategies' ends are worth putting the nation's economic power in jeopardy. The economic instrument consists of the following basic capabilities. Trade of goods and services generally increases the wealth and prosperity of trading partners. Conversely, limits or restrictions on trade, including sanctions and tariffs, can harm an adversary's economy. Finance and access to capital markets is required for modern businesses to undertake investments to increase productive capacity and for modern governments to provide expected services, infrastructure, health, welfare, education to their citizens. Restricting or impeding access to finance and banking systems can undermine others' economic prosperity. Aid is money or goods or material given by one party to another to increase the recipient's capability and or capacity. Granting aid adds to the recipient's ability to develop capabilities, while its withdrawal or reduction hinders that ability. So what does all of this mean for Britain, Neville Chamberlain, and the desired end state of avoiding war and peaceful coexistence with Germany? In 1935, Chamberlain was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He had vetoed a proposal to build up 17 divisions which could have been dispatched to Europe on the outbreak of war. When he became the Prime Minister, he demanded cutbacks in the budget for the army, which meant that the best that it could achieve was delivering on capability for Imperial policing. This meant that there would be no suitable troops that could be sent to Europe, even if it was requested by a European ally. After the Munich Agreement in September 1938, the French put increasing pressure on the British to increase their commitment. At that point, it was decided to increase the forces available to 6 regular divisions and 11 territorial divisions. In March 1939, when the Germans incorporated Czechoslovakia into the Reich, the number of territorial divisions was increased to 26. Whilst this increase in the number of divisions had been agreed and signed off on, they hadn't been manned. At the outbreak of war, it was agreed that there would be an army of 55 divisions. 14 of these would be provided by the Dominions. However, it would not be ready before 1942. This meant that the British would have little capability to influence French strategy, and this was something that Chamberlain was actually quite comfortable with. Robin Pryor discusses that the 1st of January 1940 was the 123rd day of the war. But since the twin declarations of war from France and Britain, very little had occurred in the West. In the East, of course, Poland had been wiped out by the German invasion, followed by the Russian invasion 16 days later. These twin invasions saw the end of Poland as an independent country. A war cabinet had been formed by Neville Chamberlain on the 3rd of September, so the invasion of Poland was the 1st of September. The only thing that he did that was a little bit surprising was to bring in Winston Churchill as the First Lord of the Admiralty. In the cabinet was Lord Halifax, who was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, Sir John Simon, who was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Leslie Hoare-Belisha, Minister for War, Sir Samuel Hoare, Lord Privy Seal, Sir Kingsley Wood, Secretary of State for Air, and Lord Chatfield, Minister for Coordination of Defence. Lastly, there was Lord Hankey, who was the Minister without portfolio. This was a cabinet that was full of appeasers. The declaration of war had only come about from pressure in the House of Commons. The question that troubled the War Cabinet was how were they going to prosecute the war? They had entered the war to fulfil their obligations under their treaty with Poland after it had been invaded. But what were they actually going to do, and what was the end state? It was clear at this point that they were still trying to avoid a war with Germany. When we think about the dime approach, there's a few avenues that are open to Chamberlain. The first one is a blockade. The Royal Navy, a significant source of strength, is able to blockade the import of goods into Germany. This was becoming less likely. Diplomacy had been used and abused by the Germans as they'd become increasingly belligerent, starting with the repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then there's the series of land grabs right up to the point where Poland is invaded. Diplomacy works better when you are negotiating from a position of strength. One of the other critical requirements for diplomacy to work is a willing participant. Both parties were required to be at least entertaining the idea of peaceful coexistence. Information is a very interesting part of the equation because there is an attempt by the British to influence the German people, and we're going to look into that and to see how effective that was. Churchill wanted to use the Air Force to put pressure on Germany and to support the Polish people. The only problem with this was the strength in the Air Force lay in their fighters and in their radar installations. The bomber force was not quite as potent. Fighters generally are a defensive weapon. It was the bomber force that was going to be used to take the attack to the Germans. This was what was going to enable the fight to be taken to German industry and their communications. At the start of the war, Bomber Command had just 272 aircraft. 30% of them were Fairey Battles, which was a single-engined light bomber and could carry only 1,000 pounds of bombs. The Hampden, Whitley and Wellingtons could carry up to 7,000 pounds, but the Hampdens were old, having been first constructed in 1932, and the Whitleys unstable. All of them were slow. Pryor describes the issues with the bomber force. The bomb loads could not crack concreted targets. The force had no long-range fighter capable of protecting the bombers on incursions into Germany. The crews had received little training in navigation, bomb aiming, or even flying, and there were doubts whether the skill existed even to fly in formation, which made a concerted blow against the target a dubious proposition. The War Cabinet, however, considered it to be a fearsome weapon of mass destruction. Rather looking to improve it, they were focusing on whether or not it should be unleashed against the Ruhr and other areas of German industrial production. Bombing would be also seen as a significant escalation in hostilities between Britain and Germany. Churchill was very reluctant to do this. Initially, he was helped out by Roosevelt, who made a plea to belligerents to refrain from bombing civilian targets. An Anglo-French declaration was made, and this was followed shortly after by a German one. However, on the 9th of September 1939, the Chief of the Air Staff recommended that the RAF be used more extensively, and this was because in Poland, the Luftwaffe had attacked power stations and civilian works of all kinds. In Poland, the Luftwaffe had inflicted such severe losses on the Polish Air Force that by the 6th of September, they had achieved air supremacy over Warsaw. Starting at 0800 on the 25th of September, the Luftwaffe commenced the largest air raid that had ever been conducted. They dropped 560 tonnes of high explosives and 72 tonnes of incendiary bombs. This was backed up by artillery from the army. Around 1,150 sorties were flown, including obsolete Junkers 52 aircraft. They dropped 13% of the incendiary bombs dropped on the city that day. Only 2 Junkers 52s were lost. The day was called Black Monday, and it is estimated that between the artillery and the bombing, but somewhere between 20 and 25,000 civilians were killed. 40% of the buildings in the city were damaged and 10% of the buildings were destroyed. Clearly, Roosevelt's call to refrain from targeting civilian infrastructure had been ignored by the Germans, but this was not sufficient for, in Chamberlain's mind, for retaliation strikes to be conducted. There were repeated discussions within the War Cabinet about what action would actually need to be conducted by the Germans to be construed as being decisive and that would warrant the unleashing of the bomber force. Poland did not meet the threshold. The bombing of Warsaw did not meet the threshold. The question was asked about if an invasion of Belgium would be of significant concern to see the use of the strategic bomber force. And Chamberlain himself doubted that even the German invasion of Belgium would justify bombing the Ruhr. General Ironside, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, said that surely an invasion of Belgium would have to be regarded as decisive, but Chamberlain demurred. There was clearly no appetite for the dropping of explosive ordnance on Germany by the cabinet. However, there was appetite for using the strategic bomber force for another target in another domain, and this is the informational domain. Bomber Command was employed to drop leaflets on the German population in an effort to hasten the demise of Hitler's government, enabling a peace without annexations. It was also done because if British warplanes were seen over the skies of Germany and were operating with impunity, it would lower the morale of the population. There was some unease about the dropping of leaflets, given that the Luftwaffe had been dropping bombs on Warsaw, but these were overcome. In 1939, 31 million leaflets were dropped on Germany. In 1940, across the entire year, 43 million were dropped on Germany, another 21 million on France. These were dropped after the armistice between France and Germany. Pryor, in his book, describes the leaflet war. Halifax was not sure of the utility of dropping leaflets, but Chamberlain thought that the program was good and useful. The debate over leaflet drops continued in the War Cabinet for months. By 1940, Halifax had been won over. During the first 250 days of the war, not a single bomb fell on German territory except poorly directed projectiles aimed at ships at port, which hit adjacent areas. The records reveal so many leaflet raids that the historians of bomber operations felt compelled to group them into periods to avoid constant repetition. Between the nights of the 4th and 5th of September and the 23rd, 24th of December, there were 22 leaflet raids. Between the 4th and 5th of January and 1920 January in 1940, there were probably about the same number. If, in the 1930s, British policymakers lived in the shadow of the bomber, the German people in the first 8 months of the war lived merely in the shadow of the leaflet. A critical requirement for the information campaign to be successful is a weak moral centre of gravity. The German people, still feeling significantly the effects of the Treaty of Versailles following the First World War, were not receptive to the messages that were contained in the leaflets. Many of them were fully supportive of the actions that the German government was taking under Hitler. Chamberlain argued that because the German people were natural readers, the leaflets would be a strong way of convincing them that the war was wrong and that the German government should sue for peace. However, the leaflet campaign continued. Throughout the war, 1.4 billion leaflets were dropped over occupied Europe, carrying a range of messages. These included hope in a final victory, hatred for the Germans, self-interest for the people, and self-respect. The British government looked to augment the effect of this information operation by coordinating a military/economic activity by one of the true sources of strength that the British had at their disposal, the Royal Navy. They would conduct a blockade of Germany, denying them the ability to import foodstuffs and raw materials required for industry. Chamberlain believed that it was a low risk of a blockade causing the Germans to escalate the war. The effect of the British blockade on Germany in World War I was thought by many to have had a significant part in the downfall of Germany. However, this part has been overplayed. The blockade was moderately effective, and it did impact on some of the choke points of the German economy. Significantly, oil was always a problem for the Germans. They only manufactured 120,000 tonnes of synthetic oil every month in 1939 and through to 1940. and their stockpiles were just 2.1 million tonnes, which was estimated to be about 5 months' worth for the economy under wartime conditions, and only 3 months for the Luftwaffe. In Europe, the main source of oil was Romania. Germany, being short of hard currency to purchase oil from Romania, would trade Messerschmitt fighters for oil. After they conquered Poland, however, the proximity to the German army to Romania ensured that the government was much more willing to release oil to the Germans. And in 1940, they were receiving 1.5 million tonnes of oil per year from Romania. There was a couple of problems with the blockade, though. Firstly, neutrals were able to trade through Spain. Secondly, and more importantly, the German government was able to import from the Soviet Union under their recently signed treaty. This meant that a significant range of strategic materials were able to be imported. This circumvented the effectiveness of the blockade on the German economy. So the critical capabilities that the British government have, namely the blockade, the ability to influence the German people and undermine the moral centre of gravity through bombing with leaflets, these aren't very effective. For diplomacy to be successful, a critical requirement is strength. And a critical vulnerability is the actual or perceived inability or unwillingness to go to war. And for anyone looking on at the actions of the Chamberlain government, there doesn't appear to be a significant amount of action in preparing the armed forces or the economy for a coming struggle. Industry needs to be seen to be tooling up to provide the instruments of war at an increasing pace to enable the armed forces to be able to conduct military action. What was it that Chamberlain was doing to facilitate this? It turns out, not a lot. A number of acts were passed, the Emergency Powers Act, the Control of Employment and Conscription, and these gave the government significant control over the flow of labour, but these powers weren't used to their full effect. In fact, unemployment went up. The Minister of Labour in October 1939 stated that unemployment had risen from 1 million to 1.3 million. The Conscription Act had been passed, but in the first 8 months of the war, only an extra 500,000 personnel had gone into the armed services. The Navy had increased by 61,000, the Army by 465,000, and the Air Force by just 22,000 personnel. Increases in war material were mandated. Aircraft production would be increased by just under 40% to 2,300 per month, up from 1,500. And merchant ships would go from 1 million tonnes a year to 2 million tonnes. Now, these were good plans, but there was no actual mechanism to achieve those, and two committees reported that there was no hope of achieving the targets. Chamberlain retained the targets, but with no plan to achieve them. There were significant financial constraints on the increase in the armed services. The war expenditure was planned in 1939 to 1940 to increase from £580 million to £1 billion. However, expenditure in the First World War had been £2.5 billion per year. So this was nowhere near enough to be able to put the country on a war footing. Taxes were increased, but the increase in income tax that was going to be raised was only £146 million. John Maynard Keynes, a noted economist, wrote to the Times and stated, "I don't consider the new burden in the budget excessive. Quite the contrary. What strikes me about the budget is the utter futility of the old imposts to solve the problem. Even when pushed almost to the limits of endurance. Apart from the excess profits tax, the increased taxation comes in at less than 5% of our pre-war income." He thought that only a small fraction of the nation's wealth was being tapped for warlike purposes, and that as the number of people employed and the number of hours worked by those employed would increase, the budget would actually leave increased spending power in the hands of the general public. This is the exact opposite of what a war budget should achieve. And he described the proposals of the Chancellor as chicken feed to the dragons of war. It was a laissez-faire approach to managing a wartime economy. The issue that we have for the British government and for Chamberlain himself is the adherence to a desired end state that, whilst noble, was unachievable, and that is the avoidance of war. Throughout the 1930s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Germans were becoming increasingly belligerent and less likely to kowtow to the wishes of other European nations. The adherence to that desired end state saw the selection of a centre of gravity, which is the instruments of national power, which was inappropriate and unable to achieve that desired end state. The avoidance of war precludes the use of the military in any meaningful role in deterring aggression from the German government. A misreading of the strength of the moral centre of gravity of the German population meant that there was hope that information campaigns may see a toppling of the German government and Hitler as its leader. Pressure on the German people, in concert with the blockade from the Royal Navy, was meant to ensure that the diplomatic actions would be seen by the Germans as providing a mechanism for them to back down. This was never going to be the case. Chamberlain hated war, and he hated the fact that he was being forced to act as a wartime Prime Minister. He actually thought about removing himself from office, but then decided against it because he thought that the war was nearly won. He thought that Hitler was close to a mental breakdown. He thought that the German population were close to rising up against Hitler. A series of peace feelers from a variety of sources confused the matter for Chamberlain and gave him hope that they were close to breaking the back of the German will. However, what he misread was the feelings that the German people had, particularly after the harsh impact of the Treaty of Versailles, and how well they responded to the policies of the Nazi government, particularly after they had been able to deliver military success in Poland. Churchill understood the threat that Hitler, Nazism, and the Wehrmacht represented to all of Europe. Robin Pryor goes on to say that Chamberlain was therefore only waging total war in the sense that his misreading of the German people and the Nazi regime was total. The half-hearted war was in this reading not only pathetic, it was dangerous. By not fully mobilising the vast war potential possessed by Britain in order to fight the deadliest foe that it had ever confronted, by adopting a strategy of wait and see and an economic policy of laissez-faire, the Chamberlain government was conceding to Hitler and the military initiative and allowing Germany to remedy deficiencies in its war economy. The longer the Phoney War persisted, the greater the danger to Britain. As it happened, the first existential threat to the continuation of the British state as a liberal democracy was the Chamberlain government itself. Once it became apparent for everyone in the government that the desired end state of avoiding a war at any cost was now impractical, there was a change of government. That change of government would bring about a change in the end state that was required, and it would bring about a change in the centre of gravity, and we will look at that in the next episode.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.